Please share where you're watching from and consider subscribing to the channel. The summer of 1981 was a miserable one for us all. Brian, my best friend since high school, was stuck in a soul-deadening desk job at a real estate office. I wasn't doing much better. I was bouncing between temp jobs, waiting tables when I could, and drowning in overdue bills. And then there was Alex. He worked in a warehouse, stacking boxes for minimum wage, his days bleeding into each other like some endless loop. We were all desperate for a break, something to shake us out of the monotony. That's how we landed on the idea of a camping trip. Nothing fancy, we couldn't afford that. A weekend in the woods seemed like the perfect, low-cost escape. After a bit of discussion, we settled on Blackwood Forest, a sprawling expanse of pine and oak trees about an hour's drive from the city. It wasn't unfamiliar territory. Brian and I had done a day hike there years ago, but it was wild enough to feel like a real adventure. 3 nights under the stars, away from the grind, seemed like just what we needed. We set the date for early October, right before the cold, damp weather of fall would set in. Brian dug an old 2-person tent out of his parents' garage, patched up with duct tape, but still serviceable. Alex bought a 1-man tent from a surplus store, and I contributed a cooler, some tarps, and a few other essentials. Brian also grabbed a foldable map of the forest from the park's visitor center. It was one of those old pamphlets with faded ink and creases in all the wrong places. We figured we were all set. The drive up on Friday was one of those rare moments where everything felt perfect. The sun was setting low in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gold and pink. Free Bird blasted from the car stereo as we sped along the highway with the windows down. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. We reached the park just as dusk began to settle. The parking lot at the entrance was nearly empty, just one dusty sedan parked near the ranger station. After stuffing a few bucks into the self-payment kiosk, we grabbed our gear and hiked to a campsite near Willow Lake. It was a quiet spot, surrounded by towering trees, with a clear view of the water shimmering under the fading daylight. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tents and gathering firewood before the sun dipped below the horizon. That first night was perfect. Brian got a fire going with the help of some newspaper and a lighter, and we cooked hot dogs on sticks, washing them down with cheap beer we'd brought in a cooler. Laughter echoed through the trees as we swapped stories from high school and made plans for the next day. The stress of our everyday lives melted away in the warmth of the firelight. It was exactly what we'd been hoping for. The next day, we decided to explore. Brian suggested a trail that looped around Willow Lake and led to an overlook about 3 miles away. The hike was beautiful, sunlight filtering through the canopy, leaves crunching underfoot, and the occasional glimpse of the lake through the trees. We passed the time joking about how none of us were in shape for this, and took turns stealing handfuls of trail mix from Alex's bag. The overlook was worth the effort. From the top of a rocky outcrop, we could see the forest stretching out endlessly in every direction, a sea of green and gold under a crisp blue sky. We sat there for a while, taking it all in, feeling small in the best possible way. It was peaceful, almost surreal. For the first time in months, everything felt right. But that night, everything changed. We went to bed early after another day of hiking and exploring. The fire had burned down to embers, and we were all too tired to stay up. Brian and I shared the bigger tent, while Alex's tiny 1-man tent sat a few feet away. I remember falling asleep quickly, lulled by the sound of crickets chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. I woke up sometime in the early morning, shivering. The air felt colder than it should have, damp and heavy. Groggily, I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. That's when I noticed the flap of our tent was unzipped, a thin sliver of cold air cutting through the darkness. "Brian," I whispered, sitting up. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots gone, but his jacket was still crumpled in the corner. I checked my watch, 4:30 a.m. Maybe he'd gone to the bathroom? I lay back down, waiting for the sound of footsteps or the rustle of the tent flap. But minutes passed, and there was nothing. Just silence. A knot of unease settled in my stomach. I sat up again and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the chilly pre-dawn air. The forest was pitch black, my flashlight barely illuminating the ground in front of me. "Brian?" I called out, my voice low. No response. The only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. I circled the campsite, shining my flashlight into the shadows, but there was no sign of him. By now, I was fully awake, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I called his name again, louder this time, and heard movement behind me. I spun around, heart racing, only to see Alex stumbling out of his tent, groggy and confused. "What's going on?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Brian's gone," I said. "He's not in the tent." "Maybe he's taking a leak," Alex said, but the uncertainty in his voice was obvious. I shook my head. "He's been gone too long." We decided to search together, splitting up briefly to cover more ground. The forest felt different at night, larger, more menacing. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. As we moved deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. About 20 minutes into our search, Alex called out. I ran toward his voice, flashlight bouncing wildly, and found him standing near a thorn bush. He pointed at something tangled in the branches, Brian's hat, the faded blue baseball cap he'd been wearing all weekend. From there, the trail grew more disturbing. A few yards away, we found one of his socks, then the other. His jeans were next, crumpled in the dirt, followed by his shirt and boxers, all strewn across the forest floor like breadcrumbs. By the time we found his boots, my stomach was in knots. Something was wrong, horribly, unexplainably wrong. And then we saw it. Brian's body lay in a clearing, illuminated by the pale beam of my flashlight. He was on his back, his arms at his sides, his skin pale and unmarked. But his head was gone. Blood pooled around his neck, dark and congealed, staining the earth beneath him. The cut was clean, almost surgical, and there was no sign of a struggle. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Alex, too, was paralyzed, his flashlight trembling in his hands. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the silence deafening. Then Alex broke. He started calling Brian's name, his voice cracking, pacing in frantic circles around the body. I grabbed him by the shoulders, trying to pull him back, but he shoved me away, his sobs echoing through the trees. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but I couldn't. All I could do was stare at the lifeless, headless body of my best friend. We stumbled back to camp in a daze, barely speaking. The drive to the ranger station was a blur, our minds racing with questions and fears. The rangers didn't believe us at first, but when we led them to the body, their expressions hardened. They called for backup, EMTs, police, the works, and soon the forest was swarming with flashing lights and grim-faced officers. The summer heat clung to the air like a wet blanket, but we didn't care. Myself, Dylan, and Mark had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It wasn't anything elaborate, just a simple camping trip out in the Tennessee backwoods, away from responsibilities, noise, and the constant buzz of our phones. We'd grown up together in a small town, spending our teenage years exploring the woods and camping on weekends, but life had a way of pulling us in different directions. Dylan had a sales job that kept him glued to his laptop. Mark was working construction, and I was bouncing between shifts at the local diner. We needed this trip, even if it was just one night. Dylan found the spot after scouring some online map forums. It was way out there, deep in the backcountry, far from any paved roads. "Perfect," he'd said, showing us the photo of a dirt path winding through thick pine trees. No crowds, no noise. Just us in the woods. It sounded ideal. We loaded up my pickup truck with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bags, a cooler of beer, and enough snacks to last us through the night. None of us were particularly outdoorsy anymore, but it didn't matter. We weren't planning to hike or fish. We just wanted to sit around a fire, talk about old times, and forget about the world for a while. We left town late Friday afternoon, the sun already starting to dip below the horizon. The drive was long, the roads turning from asphalt to gravel to dirt as we got closer to the spot Dylan had picked. By the time we arrived, the sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the woods around us were bathed in a golden glow. It was beautiful, almost magical, and for a moment, I felt like a kid again, ready for an adventure. We parked the truck at the edge of a small clearing and got to work setting up camp. The tent went up quickly, a simple 4-person deal that we'd borrowed from Dylan's older brother. Mark gathered firewood while Dylan and I unloaded the cooler and set up chairs around the fire pit. By the time the sun disappeared and the stars began to appear, we had a roaring fire going and beers in our hands. The night was perfect, cool, quiet, and peaceful. We sat around the fire, laughing and telling stories, the flames crackling as the woods swallowed the sound of our voices. Somewhere around midnight, I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the sky. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen, scattered across the darkness like shards of glass. Dylan was poking at the fire with a stick, and Mark was halfway through a story about some old high school football game when I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt right in the world. I didn't know it then, but it would be the last time I'd feel that way. I woke up at dawn, the sky a mix of gray and pale blue. The fire was dead, reduced to a pile of ash and embers, and the air was cool and damp. I crawled out of the tent, stretching my stiff limbs, and made my way to the truck to grab the coffee pot we'd brought. My boots crunched against the dirt and dry leaves as I walked, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness of the morning. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank. Some sick joke that Mark or Dylan had cooked up while I was asleep. But as I got closer, my stomach twisted into a tight knot, and the breath caught in my throat. There, stretched out across the hood of my truck, was a skin. An animal skin. It wasn't just tossed there. It was carefully arranged, spread flat across the metal like some grotesque offering. The fur was completely gone, scraped away to reveal raw, pink flesh that glistened in the soft morning light. Blood streaked the windshield, dark and sticky, already drying at the edges. The legs and head were gone, the stumps jagged and uneven as though they'd been hacked off with a dull blade. The smell hit me next, sour, metallic, and meaty. It was the kind of smell that clung to the back of your throat, refusing to leave. I froze, my eyes locked on the thing in front of me. My hands trembled, and for a moment I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a deer? A coyote? Some other animal? But none of that explained why it was here, why it was skinned, or why it was on my truck. I spun around, scanning the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But the forest was silent, the trees still. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple despite the coolness of the morning. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away slowly, my eyes darting between the skin and the treeline. "Dylan! Mark!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get out here!" The tent rustled, and a moment later, Dylan stumbled out, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Then he saw the truck. His face went pale, and he stopped dead in his tracks. "What the hell is that?" Mark appeared a few seconds later, his hair sticking up in all directions. He looked at the truck, then at me, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find the words. None of us could. We stood there in silence, the three of us staring at the skin like it might suddenly get up and walk away. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "It's got to be some kind of sick joke," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe some hunters messing with us?" Dylan shook his head. "Who the hell does something like this?" He stepped closer, wrinkling his nose at the smell. "And why?" I didn't have an answer, and neither did they. The longer we stood there, the more the unease grew, spreading through my chest like a cold tide. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. This wasn't just a prank. It wasn't normal. It wasn't human. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." We didn't waste any time. Mark and Dylan tore down the tent while I grabbed a stick and used it to push the skin off the hood of the truck. It hit the ground with a wet slap, and I resisted the urge to gag as I turned away. We threw everything into the back of the truck haphazardly, not bothering to fold or organize. Within minutes, we were in the cab, the engine rumbling to life as I floored it down the dirt road. The drive back was tense, the three of us sitting in silence. Dylan stared out the window, his jaw tight, while Mark fidgeted with his hands, picking at his nails until the skin around them was raw. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Every now and then, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone following us. But the road was empty, the woods behind us still and quiet. We didn't stop until we reached town. Dylan and Mark grabbed their gear and mumbled quick goodbyes before heading off in opposite directions. I watched them go, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. None of us knew what to say, and maybe it was better that way. What could we say that would make sense of what we'd seen? I spent the rest of the day scrubbing the hood of my truck, trying to wash away the blood and the smell. The water from the hose turned pink as it swirled down the driveway, and no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't shake the image of that skin stretched across the metal. It was burned into my mind, a grotesque reminder of something I didn't understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Who had done this? Why? And what did it mean? I thought about the woods, the silence, the feeling of being watched. I thought about the skin and the way it had been laid out so deliberately, like it was meant to send a message. The next day, I went to the gas station to fill up my truck and ended up talking to Mr. Harris, the owner. He'd been around forever, one of those guys who seemed to know everything about everyone. When I mentioned what had happened, his expression darkened, and he leaned in close. "You're not the first," he said, his voice low. "I've heard stories. People finding skinned animals on their cars, their porches. Always out in the deep woods. Always the same." "Why?" I asked, my throat dry. Harris shrugged. "Some say it's a warning. Others think it's something older. Something tied to the land." I didn't press him for details. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But his words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I drove home. A warning. A message. For what? I spent hours online that night, searching for answers. I found forum posts, stories, and rumors, but no real explanations. Some people blamed hunters, pranksters, or even cults. Others whispered about things older and darker, things that didn't belong in the world we knew. One post stuck with me. A man who claimed he'd seen figures in the trees after finding a skinned rabbit on his porch. He said he'd left town the next day and never looked back. I wanted to believe it was just a sick joke, a random act meant to scare us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something about that skin, about the way it was arranged, felt deliberate, intentional. And whatever the message was, it wasn't meant to be understood. It was meant to be felt. I haven't been back to the woods since that night, and I don't plan to. Mark and Dylan feel the same. We don't talk about it, there's nothing left to say. But every time I look at the hood of my truck, I see it. That raw, glistening skin. And every time I close my eyes, I feel the woods watching. It started like every trip we'd ever taken. Nate and I had been best friends since middle school, and camping had always been our tradition. No matter what was going on in our lives, relationships, jobs, the grind of adulthood, we made time every summer to pack light and head into the wilderness. We called it hardcore camping, though it was really more of a challenge to ourselves than anything else. No tents, no stoves, no luxuries. Just the basics: ponchos, ground sheets, a fishing line, and a knife each. We'd camped everywhere from the Appalachian Trail to the Rockies, but this year, Nate suggested something closer to home: Green Hollow Preserve. Green Hollow was a massive stretch of untouched forest in northern Ontario, about a 5-hour drive from where we lived. It was dense, remote, and dotted with lakes and streams. Nate had been researching it for weeks and thought it would be perfect for our kind of trip. 7 days of pure wilderness with no cell service, no crowds, and no safety nets. I was in. We set out in mid-July. The air was warm and muggy, the kind of summer heat that clings to your skin and makes the shade of the trees feel like a blessing. Nate picked me up in his beat-up Jeep early that morning, our gear packed into 2 hiking packs in the back. We spent the drive talking about everything and nothing: work, old memories, plans for the trip. Nate was always the more adventurous of the two of us, and his excitement was infectious. By the time we reached the trailhead, I was itching to get into the woods. The first few days were everything we'd hoped for. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. We hiked about 12 miles on the first day, cutting through thickets of birch and cedar, and set up camp near a bubbling creek. Nate caught a small trout on the second day, and we cooked it over a fire, splitting it between us as we drank water straight from the stream. It was peaceful, almost meditative, and I felt more relaxed than I had in months. On the 4th day, everything changed. We had been hiking north for hours, our packs lighter now that we'd eaten through most of our food. The terrain was rough, full of uneven rocks and tangled roots that made every step feel like a small victory. The forest was thick, the canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight, and the air felt cooler the deeper we went. Nate was a few paces ahead of me, his long legs making it easier for him to navigate the uneven ground. I was lagging behind, my calves burning with every step, when he suddenly stopped. "You see that?" he asked, pointing through the trees. At first, I didn't. The forest was dense, and everything seemed to blend together in shades of green and brown. But as I squinted, I saw it, a shape that didn't belong. Straight lines, sharp edges. Something man-made. "Is that a building?" I asked, my voice uncertain. Nate didn't answer. He was already moving toward it, his pace quickening as curiosity overtook him. I followed, branches snapping underfoot as we pushed through the underbrush. The closer we got, the clearer it became. It was a building. A small, weathered structure, half hidden by the trees. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. It was a church. The walls were made of old, gray wood, warped and cracked with age. The roof was steep and covered in moss, with a rusted iron cross perched at the very top. There were no windows, Just a single door at the front, its surface splintered and faded. The door was chained shut with thick, rusted links, a heavy padlock securing them in place. Another cross hung crookedly above the door, its edges sharp and uneven, almost jagged. The whole thing looked out of place, like it had been dropped there by accident and forgotten. Nate pulled out the map and spread it on the ground, tracing our route with his finger. "There's nothing here," he said, frowning. "No buildings, no landmarks. Just forest." "Maybe it's old," I offered. "Something they didn't bother putting on the map." He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the church, his brow furrowed. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the same curiosity that had led us on so many adventures before. "Let's check it out," he said, folding the map and slipping it into his pack. We circled the church, stepping over roots and ducking under low-hanging branches. The wood was rotting in places, the boards warped and discolored. On one side, a section of the wall had collapsed, leaving a jagged hole big enough for a person to crawl through. Nate crouched down to peer inside, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. "It's empty," he said, his voice echoing slightly. "Come on." I hesitated. Something about the church made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong, like we weren't supposed to be there. But I couldn't let Nate go in alone. With a sigh, I dropped to my knees and followed him through the hole. The air inside was damp and cold, heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. The floor was packed dirt, littered with dry leaves and bits of debris. The walls were bare, the wood dark and splintered. At the far end of the room stood a massive wooden cross, its surface scratched and gouged as if someone had taken a knife to it. But what caught my attention was in the center of the room. A trapdoor. It was made of steel, the edges bolted down and covered in chains. The padlock on the chains was massive, its surface rusted but solid. The trapdoor itself was covered in dirt, as though someone had tried to bury it, but the chains were clean, almost gleaming in the dim light. "What the hell?" I whispered, stepping closer. Nate knelt beside it, brushing the dirt away with his hands. "Look at this," he said, his voice low. "This isn't normal." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the trapdoor. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong in a church, or anywhere for that matter. The chains were thick, almost industrial, and the padlock looked like it hadn't been touched in years. It was unsettling. "What do you think's down there?" Nate asked, his voice tinged with excitement. "I don't know," I said, taking a step back. "And I don't think we should find out." Nate looked up at me, his expression a mix of curiosity and determination. "Come on, man. Don't you want to know? It could be anything. Treasure, old artifacts, who knows? Or it could be nothing," I countered. "Or worse, something dangerous." He shrugged, standing up and brushing the dirt off his hands. "Only one way to find out." Before I could stop him, he turned and crawled back through the hole in the wall. I followed, my heart pounding as I tried to convince him to leave it alone. But he wasn't listening. He was already pacing around the church, searching the ground for something. "What are you doing?" I asked, exasperated. "Looking for a rock," he said. "Something heavy enough to break the lock." "You're kidding, right?" I said, stepping in front of him. "This is stupid, Nate. You don't know what's down there. It could be nothing. It could be dangerous. We shouldn't mess with it." He stopped, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to him. But then he shook his head, his jaw set. "I have to know," he said quietly. "I can't just leave it." I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back. "Nate, listen to me. This isn't like you. You're acting weird. Let's just leave. Please." He yanked his arm free, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get it," he snapped. "I need to know." We stood there, staring at each other, the tension between us thick. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Fine," he said, his voice softer. "Let's just go." Relief washed over me as we grabbed our packs and headed back into the woods. But something about Nate seemed off. He was quieter than usual, his eyes distant, like he was lost in his own thoughts. I tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered. The rest of the trip felt different. The excitement and camaraderie that had defined our earlier days in the woods were gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Nate barely spoke, and when he did, his words were clipped and distracted. I caught him staring off into the distance more than once, his brow furrowed, as though he were thinking about something he couldn't quite put into words. When we finally made it back to the trailhead, I was relieved. I thought that maybe once we were out of the woods, Nate would snap out of it. But he didn't. Even on the drive home, he was quiet, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel as he stared straight ahead. The idea to go camping wasn't mine. It was Eric's. He'd gotten into this whole outdoors phase recently, hiking every weekend, reading survival books, even watching videos about how to start a fire with just sticks. I wasn't as enthusiastic. I liked the idea of the woods in theory, but I wasn't the kind of guy who found peace in nature. I liked the city. I liked streetlights, takeout joints, and being able to call an Uber when I needed one. But Eric and our other friend, Josh, were persistent. "Come on, Mike," Eric had said. "When's the last time we all did something together? It's one night in the woods. You'll survive." I rolled my eyes but eventually gave in. It wasn't like I had any better plans. Eric picked the spot, a remote patch of Harriman State Park about 2 hours north of the city. He'd found it on some hiking forum, a place that was supposedly off the beaten path, with a small lake nearby and no other campers for miles. It sounded isolated, which wasn't exactly comforting, but Eric insisted it was perfect. "Think about it," he said. "Just us, a fire, and the stars. No noise, no distractions." He made it sound like some magical escape. I wasn't convinced, but I packed my bag, grabbed a sleeping bag from my closet, and showed up at Eric's apartment on Friday afternoon. By the time we hit the road, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. The drive was uneventful. Eric and Josh spent most of it talking about the best ways to start a fire and debating whether or not there were cougars in the area. I stared out the window, watching as the buildings gave way to trees. Eventually, the asphalt turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to dirt. We bounced along the uneven road until Eric finally pulled over into a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. "This is it," he said, grinning as he killed the engine. "Home for the night." The air smelled like pine and earth, and the woods were quiet except for the distant chirp of crickets. I had to admit, it was nice. Peaceful even. We set up camp quickly, pitching a single tent big enough for the three of us and gathering wood for the fire. By the time the flames were crackling in the fire pit, the sky was dark and the stars were out in full force. We spent the night talking, laughing, and roasting marshmallows. For a while, I forgot about the isolation, the darkness pressing in around us. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. But that feeling didn't last. The next morning, I woke up early. The fire was nothing but ashes, and the air was cool and damp. Josh and Eric were still asleep, their breathing soft, and even in the tent. I slipped out quietly, stretching as I stepped into the clearing. The woods were still, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. I shook off the feeling and headed toward the truck to grab the small coffee pot we'd brought. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the morning sun filtered through the trees. But as I got closer, my stomach twisted. There, just beyond the tree line, was a shack. It was small, maybe the size of a garden shed, and weathered with age. The wood was gray and splintered, the roof sagging under the weight of moss and fallen branches. There was a single window, its glass long gone, and a door that hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, maybe longer. "Eric!" I called over my shoulder, my voice sharp with unease. "Josh, get out here." The tent rustled, and a moment later, Eric stumbled out, rubbing his eyes. "What's your problem?" he muttered, but then he followed my gaze. His expression shifted, his annoyance replaced by curiosity. Josh joined us a minute later, still half asleep, and we all stood there, staring at the shack. "Was that their last night?" Josh asked, his voice low. "I don't think so," I said. "We would have seen it, right?" "Maybe we just weren't looking," Eric said, already moving toward it. "Come on, let's check it out." I hesitated, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stay away. But I couldn't let them go alone. With a deep breath, I followed. The closer we got, the worse the shack looked. The wood was rotting in places, the boards warped and splintered. The door creaked loudly as Eric pushed it open, the sound echoing through the stillness. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, filled with the smell of mildew and decay. The interior was sparse. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, its surface stained with dark, uneven splotches. A few broken chairs were scattered in the corners, their legs splintered and jagged. The walls were lined with hooks, rusted and bent, some still holding strands of old, frayed rope. The place felt wrong, like it was holding its breath along with the forest outside. "What the hell is this?" Josh muttered, running his fingers over one of the hooks. "A hunting cabin?" "Maybe," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. He was staring at the table, his brow furrowed. "What do you think these stains are?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to think about it. My eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room, where something glinted faintly in the dim light. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and crouched down to see what it was. It was metal, rusted, pitted, and partially buried in the dirt floor. I brushed away the loose soil with my hand, revealing more of it, a curved edge, sharp and uneven. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at. "It's a helmet," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Josh and Eric joined me, their eyes widening as they took it in. The helmet was tall and pointed, almost like a pyramid, with two cross-shaped slits for eyes. The metal was thick and heavy, its surface scarred and rusted. It looked old, ancient even, and out of place in the tiny, decaying shack. "Jesus," Josh said, taking a step back. "What kind of helmet is that?" Eric crouched beside me, reaching out to touch it. "It's weird," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "It looks medieval." "Don't put it on," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop myself. I didn't know why I said it, but the thought of Eric wearing that thing made my skin crawl. He smirked, his fingers brushing the edge of the helmet. "What? You think it's cursed or something?" "I'm serious, Eric," I said, standing up. "Let's just leave it. This place is creepy enough without messing with whatever that is." Eric hesitated, then let out a sigh and stood up. "Fine," he said, brushing the dirt off his hands. "You're such a buzzkill, man." We left the shack, the door creaking shut behind us, and made our way back to camp. Eric and Josh were quieter than usual, their earlier excitement replaced by an uneasy tension. I couldn't stop thinking about the helmet, the way it had looked at me through those cross-shaped slits. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong here or anywhere. We spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the weirdness, but it clung to us like a shadow. Eric cracked a few jokes, and Josh tried to lighten the mood, but it wasn't the same. The woods felt different now, darker and less inviting. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, watching us. That night, we sat around the fire, eating instant noodles and talking in low voices. The shack came up again, and Eric suggested we go back in the morning, see if we could dig up more of the helmet or find anything else. Josh was hesitant, but Eric's enthusiasm was infectious. "We're not going back," I said firmly, cutting them off. "We've seen enough. Let's just pack up and leave in the morning." Eric rolled his eyes, but he didn't argue. The fire crackled softly as the conversation died down, and one by one, we retreated into the tent, the weight of the day pressing down on us. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of footsteps. It was faint at first, just a soft crunch of leaves, but it was enough to jolt me awake. I sat up, my heart racing, and listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving just outside the tent. I held my breath, my ears straining against the silence. "Eric?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Josh?" No response. I reached for the flashlight beside me and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The woods were still, the trees looming like silent sentinels. But there was no one there. I turned back to the tent, my hands trembling, when I noticed something on the ground. It was faint, almost invisible in the darkness, but as I crouched down, I saw it clearly: footprints. They were large, far larger than any of ours, and they led straight toward the shack. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the time dawn broke, I was already packed, ready to leave. Eric and Josh didn't argue. Something about the night had shifted their mood, and they were just as eager to get out of the woods as I was. We didn't talk much on the drive back. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and lingering fear. The shack, the helmet, the footsteps, it was too much to process, too strange to make sense of. I haven't been back to Harriman State Park since that trip, and I don't plan to. Whatever we found in that shack, whatever was buried in the dirt, it wasn't meant to be uncovered. And sometimes late at night, I can still see it, the helmet staring at me through those cross-shaped slits, watching. 15 years ago, when I was 31, I found myself standing at the edge of the world, or at least it felt that way. My life back then was a shattered mirror, its pieces scattered across moments of grief and despair I could barely hold together. I had lost everything that mattered, my daughter Lily, to a vicious illness that robbed her of her light, and my wife, Clara, to the crushing weight of that grief. She had taken her own life 6 months after Lily's passing. And me? I was a hollow man walking through a world that didn't feel real anymore. In my desperation, I decided to disappear into the wilderness of Canada and Alaska. I didn't tell anyone about the true purpose of my journey. I called it finding myself, but in truth, I had no intention of returning. My plan was simple: travel into the secluded boreal forest, far from civilization, and let nature consume me. I spent an entire year planning the trip, pouring my life savings, around $70,000, into crafting the perfect escape. It was reckless, but I didn't care. What was money when I had nothing left to live for? The trip was divided into 2 parts. The first 3 months would involve traveling alongside guides, indigenous locals who knew the land far better than I ever could. They would help me navigate the vast, remote landscapes, ensuring I got to experience the raw beauty of the wilderness. The final leg of the journey was the one I looked forward to most: a 4-week solo camping trip deep in the heart of the Ontario boreal forest. No guides, no safety net, just me and the void. It sounded perfect. The guides were better than I anticipated. They were warm, knowledgeable, and deeply connected to the land. They shared stories passed down through generations, tales of spirits and creatures that roamed the forests, warnings wrapped in myth. I listened, intrigued but skeptical. The nights were filled with laughter, the flicker of campfires, and the hauntingly beautiful crackling of the northern lights overhead. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But peace is a fragile thing. When we reached Fort 7, the last waypoint on my guided journey, I bid farewell to the group. They wished me luck and warned me to respect the forest, gifting me a small carved totem for protection. I tucked it into my jacket pocket, more out of courtesy than belief, and set off alone the next morning. The first 2 days were uneventful but challenging. The forest was dense, a labyrinth of towering pines and tangled undergrowth. My GPS guided me to a predetermined campsite each night, and I stuck to my routine: hang food in a tree, light a fire, eat, and sleep. By the 3rd morning, though, I noticed something odd. My belongings, which I'd carefully packed away, were scattered across the ground. My first thought was animals, maybe raccoons or foxes, but I hadn't heard a single sound during the night. The forest had been unnervingly silent, as if it were holding its breath. Shrugging it off, I gathered my things and pressed on. That day, the sense of unease grew stronger. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was desperate for the comfort of a campfire. I found a clearing, set up my hammock, and lit a fire. The flickering flames cast long shadows over the trees, and for a while, I felt safe. Then the voice came. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling fire. "Help me." It was a child's voice, small and trembling, carried on the wind. My heart stopped. I strained my ears, clutching my flashlight. "Help me, I'm lost," the voice called again, closer this time. It was Lily's voice. I stood, my legs shaking. "Lily?" I called out, my voice breaking. "Is that you?" Silence. Then the voice changed. It deepened, distorted, and the words that followed were a mockery of human speech. "Help me," it growled, dragging out the syllables like a predator toying with its prey. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A figure hunched among the trees, its arms unnaturally long, fingers splayed like claws. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth, oh God, its mouth, stretched into a grotesque grin, too wide, too full of teeth. It tilted its head, and the motion was wrong, like a glitch in reality. Then it began to move. It didn't walk. It crawled, limbs snapping and twisting as it dragged itself towards me. The sound of cracking bones filled the air, and I could feel its malice like a physical force. My body froze, paralyzed by fear, until a whisper cut through the chaos. "Run!" It was Clara's voice this time, soft and urgent. It broke the spell, and I bolted, leaving everything behind: my gear, my food, my fire. I ran blindly through the forest, branches tearing at my skin, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind me. It called out in Lily's voice, then Clara's, pleading, taunting, laughing. "Where are you going, Jack? Don't you want to join us?" I stumbled down a hill and landed in a muddy pit. The cold, wet earth sucked at my clothes, and I lay there, trembling, as the voices closed in. "Jack," it whispered, so close I could feel its breath. "I'm hungry." Then nothing. The forest grew quiet again, and the first rays of dawn pierced through the canopy. I waited until the sunlight was fully overhead before crawling out of the pit. My body ached, my mind was shattered, but I was alive. Somehow I was alive. It took me 5 days to find a country road. I survived on the emergency rations in my pouch and drank from streams, sleeping in ditches at night. The creature, or whatever it was, never stopped hunting me. I heard its whispers in the darkness, felt its presence just beyond the edge of my vision. But it couldn't find me, not fully. The mud, I realized, had masked my scent. When I finally stumbled onto the road, a lone trucker stopped to help me. His name was Frank, an older man with kind eyes. I told him a sanitized version of my story, something about animals chasing me through the forest, and he nodded grimly. "You were lucky," he said. "Not everyone makes it out of those woods. My brother didn't." Frank drove me to a nearby town, and I stayed with him and his brother, Sam, for a few days. When I recounted the full story to them, Sam's face turned pale. "I've seen it too," he whispered. "It's real." Sam and I sat in silence in Frank's dimly lit kitchen, while the old trucker busied himself with preparing coffee. The room smelled faintly of pine wood and something metallic, like the scent of a blade freshly sharpened. Sam's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, the matchstick shaking as if the memory of his encounter had crawled back to the surface. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice hoarse. It felt like gravel scraping against my throat. Sam exhaled a cloud of smoke and stared at the table as if searching for the right words. "It was years ago," he began, his voice a low rasp. "I was hunting elk near the same stretch of forest you were in. Thought I'd hit the jackpot when I spotted a bull near the tree line. But when I got closer, it wasn't an elk. It wasn't anything natural." He paused, his eyes flicking toward the window as if expecting the creature to be watching. "It was hunched, like you said, but big. Bigger than anything I've ever seen. And it wasn't just the size, it was the way it moved. Like it didn't belong here, like it didn't belong anywhere." My stomach churned as he described the creature in detail. The glowing eyes, the unnaturally wide mouth, the limbs that seemed to bend and snap in ways that defied anatomy. It was identical to what I had seen, down to the sinister mimicry of voices. "It called out to me," Sam said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Sounded like my wife, Sarah. She passed years ago, but it knew her voice. It knew her name." I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. "How did you get away?" Sam's lips twitched into a bitter smile. "I didn't. Not really. I ran, same as you. But it left me something to remember it by." He rolled up the sleeve of his flannel shirt, revealing a long, jagged scar running down his forearm. "It caught me as I climbed a ridge. Raked its claws down my arm like it wanted me to feel it, to remember it." "Why didn't you warn anyone?" I asked, the question spilling out before I could stop it. "If you knew something like this was out there, who was I supposed to tell?" Sam snapped, his voice rising. "The cops? The rangers? I'd sound like a lunatic. No one would believe me, just like no one's gonna believe you." I wanted to argue, but deep down, I knew he was right. Even as I sat there, the memories of the thing I had seen felt surreal, like a fever dream. Who would believe a story about a creature that mimicked voices, stalked the woods, and moved like a nightmare brought to life? Frank returned to the table, setting down 3 steaming mugs of black coffee. "Whatever it is," he said, his tone grave, "it's been around a long time. I've heard the stories from truckers passing through. They call it the skinwalker, or the wendigo, or some other name I can't pronounce. Every culture around here has a different version of it, but the gist is always the same. It hunts the lost, the broken, the ones who wander too far." The words sent a chill down my spine. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did it come after me?" Frank and Sam exchanged a look, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "You said you were out there alone, right?" Frank asked. I nodded. "That's why. It preys on isolation. It knows when you've got no one to turn to, no one to call for help. And it feeds on your pain." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature had chosen me for a reason, that it had sensed the hollow ache inside me and latched onto it like a predator scenting blood. Despite my better judgment, I stayed in Kenora for a few more days, trying to make sense of what had happened. Frank offered me a place to sleep, and Sam reluctantly agreed to share more of his experiences. The conversations were a strange mix of catharsis and dread, each story adding another layer to the horrifying puzzle. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't leave things as they were. My gear was still out there, abandoned in the forest. My GPS, my wallet, my supplies, everything I had brought with me was scattered across the campsite. I didn't care about the material loss, but the idea of leaving it behind felt like surrendering a part of myself to the creature, like letting it win. "I'm going back," I announced one morning over breakfast. Frank nearly choked on his coffee. "Are you out of your damn mind?" "I have to," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I can't let it haunt me forever. I need to face it, to take back what's mine. You don't owe that thing anything, Sam said, his tone sharp. You're lucky you got out alive. Don't push your luck. But my mind was made up. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my life, not anymore. Frank eventually relented, agreeing to drive me as far as the edge of the forest. I'll wait for you here, he said as I stepped out of the truck. If you're not back by nightfall, I'm coming in after you. I nodded, gripping the small hunting knife Frank had lent me. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The forest was different this time. The sunlight seemed dimmer, the trees darker, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. Every step felt heavier, as if the ground were trying to pull me down. I followed the GPS coordinates, retracing my steps to the campsite. The hours stretched on, each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending my heart racing. When I finally reached the clearing, my breath caught in my throat. The campsite was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The totem the guides had given me was lying in the center of the fire pit, charred and broken. A message, clear as day: you are not welcome here. I gathered my belongings as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The air felt charged, like the forest was holding its breath. And then, just as I was finishing, I heard it. Jack! It was Clara's voice, soft and sweet, calling out from the trees. Jack, come back to me. I froze, clutching the knife tightly. You're not real, I whispered, my voice trembling. You're not her. The voice laughed, low and guttural. Come closer, Jack. Don't you miss us? The figure emerged from the shadows, and my stomach turned. It was Clara, or at least it looked like her. But her eyes were wrong, too bright and too sharp, and her smile stretched unnaturally wide. Stay with us, she said, her voice layered with something monstrous. I ran. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line, collapsing onto the road where Frank's truck was waiting. He hauled me into the cab without a word and sped off, the tires kicking up gravel as we left the forest behind. There's something about Wyoming that feels infinite. It's a state of vast, unyielding landscapes, empty, yet full of something both ancient and untamed. I didn't know that when I set out on my trip. I was just a guy in his 20s, jobless and carefree, with nothing but time and a shiny new car to take me anywhere I wanted to go. Well, it wasn't exactly new. A 2009 Toyota RAV4 isn't going to turn any heads, but compared to the clunkers I'd driven before, it might as well have been a spaceship. I figured there was no better way to break it in than a road trip. My friend Mark had been car camping across the U.S. for months, and we'd made a plan to meet in Wyoming's Medicine Bow National Forest. It was my first real outdoor excursion, and I packed like someone who didn't quite know what they were doing. A sleeping bag, a tent, a cheap stove, and whatever else I could cram into the trunk. The excitement of adventure dulled any worries I might have had, and as I drove into the forest, the asphalt faded into dirt roads, and the world transformed into something wilder. Mark and I met at a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the air crisp with the lingering cool of early June. It was beautiful, the kind of place that makes you feel like you've stepped into a postcard. Snow drifts still clung to the shaded corners of the forest, remnants of a long winter, but the glacier lilies and bright green grass hinted at the summer trying to push through. The only sound was the hum of my tires and the occasional chirp of birds. No cell service, no traffic, no distractions. Just us and the wilderness. We drove deeper into the forest, our vehicles bouncing over muddy ruts and icy patches. The further we went, the more isolated it felt. By the time we chose a campsite, a partially burned clearing with a view of a distant alpine mesa, it was clear we were the only ones out there. The sun sank behind the hills as we set up camp, and soon the sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink. It was the kind of sunset that makes you forget the world exists beyond the trees. After dinner, we sat by the fire, trading stories and roasting bratwursts. The crackle of the flames and the soft murmur of wind through the pines created a rhythm that lulled us into a comfortable silence. That's when I saw it, a bright light on the horizon, low and steady. Do you see that? I asked, pointing. Mark turned, squinting. Yeah, what is that? At first, I thought it was a car's headlights. But the light was too bright, too constant. It didn't flicker or move, it just grew. A slow, steady pulse of white light that seemed to rise from the earth itself. My stomach tightened. Could it be a forest fire? The thought sent a jolt of panic through me. We were miles from any kind of help, surrounded by dry trees and snow-dampened brush. If it was a fire, we'd have no chance of outrunning it. Mark and I scrambled to gather our gear, our laughter from earlier replaced by tense silence. The light grew brighter, illuminating the trees in sharp relief. Shadows stretched and twisted across the ground, and the air felt electric, like the moments before a thunderstorm. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light revealed itself for what it was, the moon. A full moon, impossibly large and impossibly bright, rising above the horizon like a celestial spotlight. Mark and I stared at it, dumbfounded, before bursting into laughter. We had just spent the last 10 minutes panicking over the moon. It was ridiculous, absurd even, but in that moment, it felt like the most natural mistake in the world. The wilderness has a way of playing tricks on you, especially when you're not used to its rhythms. But the laughter didn't last long. The next morning, we packed up camp and headed further north, aiming for a secluded reservoir deep in the forest. The roads were worse than the day before, thick with mud and slushy snow that made every mile feel like a battle. Mark's 4Runner handled the terrain with ease, but my RAV4 struggled. The summer tires I'd been so proud of were no match for the forest's unrelenting grip. At one point, we came across a massive snow drift blocking the road. Mark managed to plow through it, his tires spinning and spitting chunks of ice, but when it was my turn, my car sank like a stone. The snow swallowed my wheels, and no amount of rocking or revving could free it. I was stuck. Mark grabbed a tow strap from his trunk, and we spent the next hour digging, shoveling, and cursing as we fought to pull my car free. By the time we succeeded, my undercarriage cover was ripped to shreds, and the road ahead was an impassable mess. We had no choice but to turn around and find another route. The reservoir was worth the struggle. Nestled between snow-capped hills and dense pines, it looked like something out of a fairy tale. The water was glassy and still, reflecting the sky in perfect clarity. We spent the afternoon exploring the shoreline, our earlier frustrations melting away. But as the sun dipped lower, the air grew colder, and the clouds began to gather. By the time we left the reservoir, the first snowflakes were falling. It was June, but Wyoming didn't seem to care. The snow came fast and heavy, blanketing the roads in a matter of minutes. Visibility dropped to a few feet, and every turn felt like a gamble. We were completely lost, our phones useless without service, and the maps we'd seen at the reservoir were a distant memory. When we reached a clearing, we stopped to assess our options. The snow was too thick to drive through, and neither of us had the gas to waste on aimless wandering. We decided to make camp and wait out the storm. It wasn't ideal, but it was all we could do. The night was brutal. My sleeping bag wasn't rated for the cold, and I spent hours shivering in my car, my breath fogging up the windows. Mark's setup was better, but even he admitted he hadn't expected a blizzard. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the branches and rattling the cars. It felt like the forest was alive, angry at our intrusion. When the storm finally broke the next morning, the world was unrecognizable. The snow had transformed the forest into a white, alien landscape. Roads were invisible, buried beneath drifts of snow and ice. We decided to hike to the reservoir's parking area, hoping to find a map or some clue about how to get out. The walk was surreal. The air was crisp and silent, the snow crunching under our boots the only sound. We passed a small creek that had partially frozen over, its surface glittering in the sunlight. For a moment, the beauty of it all made me forget the danger we were in. At the parking area, we found a large map of the forest. It showed 3 main routes in and out, 2 of which we already knew were blocked. The third route, a winding road that led to a small town called Albany, became our only hope. We marked it on our phones and set off, determined to find our way out. The drive was tense. Every turn brought the possibility of another snow drift or a fallen tree. At one point, we passed a small grave marker nailed to a tree, its weathered wood and faded writing sending a chill down my spine. The isolation was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After hours of navigating the maze of back roads, we finally saw tire tracks in the snow. They led us to a cluster of cabins, and beyond that, the blessed sight of asphalt. We had made it back in one piece. I've always loved the woods. Out there, far from the city, I could breathe. I could think. I could be alone without feeling like I was being watched or judged. As a woman, especially in the city, the world always felt like it was closing in on me. Eyes following me on the subway, footsteps trailing me too closely down darkened streets. But in the forest, it was different. The only eyes belonged to the deer and the birds, and the only footsteps were my own. It was February when I decided to head out on a solo winter camping trip. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but this would be my first time camping completely alone in the dead of winter. The idea thrilled me, a weekend of quiet, untouched snow, and the sharp, clean air of the San Juan National Forest in southwestern Colorado. I packed my gear carefully: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a small camping stove, and enough food for 3 days. I told my parents where I'd be, left a note for my roommate, and drove out early on a Friday morning. The road into the forest was narrow and winding, the kind of road that makes you aware of just how far you're going from civilization. The trees stretched high on either side, their branches heavy with snow. I parked at a small turnout near a trailhead, grabbed my map and compass, and started hiking. The forest was alive with the muffled silence of winter, branches creaking under the weight of snow, the occasional caw of a raven, and the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I hiked about 4 miles in before I found a spot that felt perfect. It was a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, with a view of a frozen creek glinting in the pale sunlight. The air smelled like cedar and cold. I set up my tent, dug a small fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last the night. By the time the sun began to set, the world around me had turned into a painting, all soft blues and whites, the snow glowing faintly in the fading light. That first night was uneventful, peaceful even. The fire crackled softly as I sipped hot tea from a thermos, the warmth spreading through my chest. I listened to the distant sound of a waterfall, half frozen but still gurgling somewhere upstream. When the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, burrowed into my sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. The next day, I decided to try my hand at ice fishing. The map showed a small lake about a mile from my campsite, and I figured it would be a good way to pass the time. When I reached the lake, it was breathtaking, an expanse of pure, untouched ice surrounded by dense forest. It felt like I was the only person in the world. I punched a hole in the ice with my auger, dropped my line, and waited. It didn't take long before I felt a tug. The fish were hungry, desperate even, and I caught 2 within the first hour. As I prepared to clean the first one, a strange feeling crept over me, a prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming the isolation for making me jumpy. That's when I heard it, a faint whistling, barely audible over the cold wind. It was slow, deliberate, a tune that seemed to drift through the trees. I froze, my knife halfway through the fish, and listened. The melody was haunting, simple but eerie, like a child's lullaby played too slowly. I looked around, but the forest was empty. The lake was silent, except for the occasional groan of shifting ice. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the wilderness. The whistling stopped. For a moment, I felt foolish. It was probably the wind, I told myself, or some strange acoustics playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I packed up my gear and headed back to camp, glancing over my shoulder more times than I'd like to admit. It wasn't until I was almost back that I saw it, the moose. It lay half buried in the snow, its massive body grotesquely twisted. Blood stained the ground around it, a stark contrast against the white. Its eyes were open, wide and frozen in terror, staring straight at me. The bullet wound was clean, a single shot through one eye. It should have been a straightforward kill. But something about the scene felt wrong. The air around the carcass was heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The whistling began again, louder this time, and I swear it was coming from the direction of my camp. I ran. Branches clawed at my jacket as I stumbled through the trees, my breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. When I reached my campsite, the fire pit was cold, the wood I'd gathered scattered across the snow. My tent stood untouched, but the sight of it filled me with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. As night fell, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. No owls, no distant waterfalls, not even the wind. Just silence. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife, my ears straining for any sound. The whistling came again, closer now, weaving through the trees like a dark thread. I shouted into the darkness, my voice cracking. "Who's there? What do you want?" No response. The whistling stopped, replaced by a new sound, the crunch of snow beneath heavy boots. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling just beyond the firelight. I gripped the knife tighter, my palms slick with sweat despite the cold. "Stay back!" I yelled, but the footsteps didn't stop. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they were gone. The forest was silent again, but the damage was done. I couldn't sleep, couldn't even bring myself to crawl into my tent. I sat by the dying embers of the fire, my back against a tree, and waited for the dawn. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I didn't care about the rest of my supplies. I just wanted to get out. The hike back to my car felt endless, every shadow and sound a potential threat. When I finally reached the road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But it wasn't over. That night, after I'd driven to the nearest motel, my phone rang. It was a park ranger I'd spoken to earlier, someone I'd mentioned the moose carcass to before leaving the forest. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "We found your campsite," he said. "The moose was dragged there." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "The carcass," he continued, "was pulled from where you saw it to your camp. There's a lot of blood. And your tent, it was slashed. Looked like someone took a knife to it." I gripped the phone tighter, my hand trembling. "Was it an animal?" The ranger hesitated. "I don't think so. There were no tracks, just drag marks. Like it was pulled on a tarp." I didn't respond. What could I say? The whistling tune played in my mind, a haunting melody I knew I'd never forget. "What about my gear?" I finally asked. "You don't want it back," the ranger said. "Trust me." I hung up and stared at the wall of the motel room, the weight of the experience pressing down on me. I'd gone into the forest seeking solitude, peace, a chance to escape the chaos of the city. Instead, I'd found something darker, something that followed me in the silence and left me with scars I couldn't see but would always feel. The forest outside Coos Bay, Oregon, isn't like other forests. It's dense, wild, and ancient, with a kind of stillness that feels alive in its own way. The trees there are tall and relentless, their trunks coated in moss, their branches interlocking like the fingers of giants. It was the kind of place that made you feel small, insignificant even, but I loved it for that. It was where I went to hunt, to get away from the noise of the world and lose myself in the silence of nature. That October, the air carried the sharp bite of Pacific chill, and the sky hung low and gray, threatening rain. It had been a rough year. Work was slow, bills were piling up, and I was feeling the weight of life pressing down harder than usual. So I grabbed my rifle, packed some supplies, and drove out to one of my favorite ridges, a patch of old cedar forest that had been clear-cut a few years ago. The landscape there was a mix of dead stumps, new growth, and the occasional patch of second-growth timber. It wasn't the prettiest place, but it was quiet, and that was all I needed. I arrived in the early afternoon, parked my truck at the end of an old logging road, and hiked in about a mile. The clear-cut stretched out below me, a stark field of broken trees and regenerating brush, and beyond it was the dense wall of second-growth timber. That's where the game would be, I figured, hiding in the shadows of the thicker forest. I found a good spot near the edge of the clear-cut, climbed up into my portable tree stand, and settled in. I was about 20 feet off the ground, nestled against the trunk of an old cedar, with a clear view of the timberline and the open ground in front of me. The hours passed slowly, as they always do when you're hunting. I scanned the landscape, my eyes tracing the movement of wind through the brush, the flutter of a bird in the distance. But there was nothing, no deer, no elk, not even the crows that usually hung around these parts. It was quiet, unnervingly so. I told myself it was just the time of day, that the animals were probably bedded down and would start moving as the sun dipped lower. It wasn't until early evening, when the sky began to turn a soft purple, that I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a rustling in the brush near the timberline. It could have been the wind, but the sound had a rhythm to it, 2 steps, then a pause, 2 more steps. It was deliberate, heavy like something large was moving through the undergrowth. My pulse quickened as I scanned the edge of the forest, my rifle steady in my hands. I was expecting to see a bull elk, maybe even a bear. But what I saw was something else entirely. The sound grew louder, and then came the snap, a violent, dry crack that echoed through the clearing. I whipped my head toward the noise just in time to see one of the young pines near the timberline collapse. It didn't fall naturally. It snapped clean about 3 feet off the ground, the top half crashing down with a rustle of branches and a heavy thud. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at the fallen tree, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. And then I saw it. Just beyond the broken tree, something moved. It was massive, a dark blur of fur and muscle that seemed to glide between the trees. The light was fading fast, but I could make out enough to know that whatever it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer or a moose either. It moved upright with a fluidity that was almost human, but it was too big, easily over 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful strides. Its fur was dark, almost black, and it caught the last slivers of twilight as it moved deeper into the timber. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as I tried to process what I was seeing. My mind screamed at me to run, to climb down from the stand and get the hell out of there, but my body wouldn't listen. I sat there, gripping my rifle, staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. Then it hit me, it had seen me. The realization sent a jolt of cold fear through my chest. Whatever that thing was, it had looked straight at me before it vanished into the trees. I didn't see its face, but I felt its gaze like a weight pressing down on me. It wasn't the kind of fear you feel when you're startled or surprised. This was something deeper, primal, a terror that reached into the oldest parts of my mind and told me, in no uncertain terms, that I was prey. I don't remember climbing down from the stand. One moment I was sitting there, frozen, and the next I was on the ground, my boots slipping on the damp earth as I ran back toward the logging road. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I slammed it into gear and tore down the narrow dirt road, the headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. Even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere in the shadows of the forest. When I finally made it back to the main road, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced through every possibility, what it could have been, what I'd actually seen. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I kept coming back to the same conclusion. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't something I'd ever seen before, and I prayed I'd never see it again. I didn't go back to that ridge after that. Hell, I didn't go hunting at all for months. The encounter stayed with me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. I'd be sitting at home, watching TV or eating dinner, and suddenly I'd feel that same cold fear, the memory of those glowing eyes and the sound of the tree snapping in half playing over and over in my head. I told a few people about it, friends, family, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They'd smile politely, nod, and then change the subject. I didn't blame them. If someone had told me a story like that, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. It was late spring in northern Arizona, and I was riding the high of a solo road trip that had been nothing short of incredible so far. I'd spent weeks weaving through national parks, small towns, and roadside oddities, chasing the kind of freedom that only comes when you're completely untethered. My car, an aging Jeep Cherokee I'd affectionately named Lucy, had become my home, and the open road my sanctuary. At that point, I was just leaving Walnut Canyon National Monument. The sun was bleeding out over the horizon, the sky shifting from gold to deep purple, and I realized I'd stayed far later than I'd intended. The roads were empty, the kind of empty that feels like you've fallen off the edge of the world. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and Lucy's gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. I kept telling myself I'd find a gas station soon, but the miles stretched on, the needle inching lower with every passing minute. Anxiety started to creep in, the realization that I might end up stranded in the middle of nowhere gnawing at the back of my mind. That's when I saw it, a crooked wooden sign nailed to a post, faded lettering barely legible in the dying light, Coyote Flats Campground. There was an arrow pointing down a dirt road that disappeared into the trees. No mention of gas, no indication of how far it was, but I was desperate. I turned onto the dirt road, Lucy's tires crunching over gravel as I drove deeper into the forest. The road twisted and turned, the trees growing denser, their shadows swallowing the last traces of daylight. After what felt like an eternity, the road opened up into a small clearing, and there it was, Coyote Flats. The campground was a loose collection of fire pits and weathered picnic tables scattered among the trees. There were no lights, no ranger station, and no other signs of civilization, save for a rusty blue cooler sitting on the ground near a fire pit. That's where I saw them, a man and a woman, both in their mid to late 20s, sitting on folding chairs and sipping from cans of cheap beer. I pulled Lucy into the nearest spot and stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. The man looked up first, lanky and hollow-cheeked, with a fixed grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The woman followed, her long, tangled hair catching the firelight as she smiled faintly, almost like she'd been expecting me. "Hey there," the man said, his voice casual but carrying an edge I couldn't quite place. "You lost?" "Not exactly," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. "I was just looking for a place to camp for the night. Do you know if there's a gas station around here?" The man exchanged a glance with the woman before answering. There's one about 2 miles up the road. Problem is, it's closed after dark. The woman nodded, her smile widening. You're welcome to stay here, though. There's a spot open right next to us. I hesitated, the uneasy feeling in my gut growing stronger. Something about them felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on why. But the idea of driving aimlessly through the forest, running out of gas, and spending the night stranded in the middle of nowhere wasn't any better. I forced a smile and nodded. Thanks. I appreciate it. I started setting up my tent in the spot they'd pointed out, a small patch of dirt framed by 2 pine trees. My hands shook slightly as I hammered in the stakes, though I tried to tell myself it was just the long day catching up with me. The man wandered over after a few minutes, an axe slung casually over his shoulder. Need a hand? He asked, his grin never faltering. I didn't want to be rude, so I nodded. Sure, thanks. He knelt beside me, driving the stakes into the ground with the axe handle. His movements were quick and practiced, almost too practiced, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. When he finished, he stood and dusted off his hands. There you go. All set. Before I could thank him, the woman appeared, her head tilted curiously. You got any pills? She asked, her tone light, like she was asking about the weather. Pills? I repeated, caught off guard. Yeah, like, anything good? Xanax, Oxy, Adderall. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes were sharp, studying me. No, I said quickly. Just some ibuprofen. Her expression faltered for a split second before brightening again. What about weed? Got any of that? Reluctantly, I admitted I had a little left over from Washington. Her face lit up like I'd just handed her a winning lottery ticket. Nice, she said. You're cool. They drifted back to their fire pit after that, leaving me to finish setting up. I tried to shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin, telling myself they were just quirky, maybe a little rough around the edges. But then the woman called out again. Don't forget to pay for your sight. I glanced up, confused. Pay? Yeah, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the trees. There's a self-service box down the trail. Just write your credit card number down if you don't have cash. My stomach twisted. I'll check it out later, I lied. Sure, she replied, her smile never faltering. No rush. The firelight flickered in her eyes, and I had to look away. A few minutes later, she reappeared at my tent. You should meet the neighbors, she said, her tone breezy. Before I could protest, she grabbed my arm and started leading me toward a battered old RV tucked deeper into the trees. The RV looked like it hadn't moved in years. Its tires were flat, the windows patched with cardboard, and the metal sides were streaked with rust. Empty beer cans littered the ground around it, and the faint smell of something sour and rancid wafted through the air. Inside, a man sat slumped in a torn armchair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. He looked older, maybe in his 50s, with a scruffy beard and bloodshot eyes. A woman stood at a grimy stove, stirring something in a pot that smelled faintly of grease and onions. This is Jim, the younger woman said, gesturing to the man in the chair. And that's Linda. Jim grunted in acknowledgement, barely glancing at me. Linda turned from the stove and offered me a greasy smile. You hungry? I'm making tacos. I shook my head. No thanks. I'm good. You sure? Jim slurred, his voice thick and slow. Ain't polite to turn down a meal. Before I could respond, Linda shoved a paper plate into my hands, a greasy taco balanced precariously on top. Eat up, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I took a tentative bite, the grease dripping down my chin. It tasted as bad as it smelled, but I forced it down, not wanting to offend them. Jim watched me the whole time, his bloodshot eyes unblinking. You catch what you eat, he said suddenly, his voice low and gravelly. That's the rule out here. I nodded awkwardly, unsure of what to say. He leaned forward, his lips curling into a grin. And if you don't catch anything, you eat what you find. I froze, the taco halfway to my mouth. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. Linda laughed, a sharp, humorless sound, and turned back to the stove. I mumbled some excuse about needing to check my car and bolted out of the RV, tossing the taco to a dog that had been lurking near the door. The dog sniffed it hesitantly before devouring it in one bite. I hurried back to my tent, my heart pounding in my chest. The man and woman by the fire didn't say anything as I passed, though I could feel their eyes on me. I sat in my camp chair, staring at the fire, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. After a few minutes, the man wandered over again. "You heading to the gas station in the morning?" he asked casually. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we'll ride with you," he said, his grin widening. "You know, just to make sure you don't get lost." I forced a laugh. "Sure. Sounds good." As soon as he walked away, I started packing. I didn't care how late it was or how little gas I had left. I wasn't staying another minute. I tore down my tent, shoved everything into the back of Lucy, and peeled out of the campground without looking back. The gas station was closed when I got there, but I didn't care. I parked in the lot, locked the doors, and tried to calm my racing heart. The next morning, I drove to a bed and breakfast I'd passed earlier and told the woman at the desk what had happened. She let me park in the back lot and use the bathroom, her kind smile a stark contrast to the unnerving grins I'd left behind. The lake didn't have a name, not one that anyone remembered anyway. It was just the lake, an isolated body of water tucked deep into the forests of northern Minnesota. My buddy Clay had been coming here for years, swearing up and down that it was the best hidden fishing spot in the state. No tourists, no noisy campsites, just pristine water and plenty of fish. It was the kind of place you only found if someone told you about it, a secret passed down like an heirloom. It was late August when Clay finally convinced me to join him for a weekend trip out there. We'd both had a rough couple of months, work stress, family drama, the usual, and a few days in the wilderness sounded like the perfect escape. We loaded up his old Chevy with our gear, tents, fishing rods, a cooler full of beer, and just enough food to last us until Sunday. The drive was long, the kind that takes you through winding back roads and tiny towns where time seems to have stopped. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The hike to the lake was about 3 miles, the trail overgrown and barely marked. Clay led the way, his machete slicing through the underbrush while I lagged behind, swatting at mosquitoes and trying to keep my balance on the uneven ground. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. There was no sound but the crunch of our boots, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. When we finally broke through the tree line and saw the lake, I had to admit, it was beautiful. The water was glassy and still, reflecting the fiery colors of the sunset. A thin mist clung to the surface, giving it an almost ethereal quality. The shoreline was lined with smooth stones and patches of tall grass, and beyond that, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. There wasn't another soul in sight. "This is it," Clay said, spreading his arms wide like he was presenting me with a gift. "What do you think?" "It's perfect," I admitted, already feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. "Let's set up camp before it gets dark." We found a flat spot near the water's edge and pitched our tents, the process made slower by the fact that Clay insisted on cracking open a beer for every stake he hammered into the ground. By the time we finished, the sky had turned a deep indigo, and the first stars were beginning to appear. We built a small fire, cooked up some hot dogs, and sat by the flames, watching the last light fade from the horizon. The first night was uneventful, peaceful even. The fire crackled softly, the lake lapped gently at the shore, and the distant hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. Clay and I swapped stories, laughed about old times, and made plans for all the fish we were going to catch the next day. When the fire died down, we crawled into our tents, the cool night air lulling us to sleep. The next morning, we were up with the sun. The lake was even more stunning in the daylight, the water so clear you could see the rocks and weeds at the bottom near the shore. We spent most of the day fishing, paddling out in a small inflatable raft Clay had brought along. The fish were biting, just like he'd promised, and by mid-afternoon, we had enough for a proper feast. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, we cleaned our catch and cooked it over the fire. The smell of fresh fish filled the air, and for a while, everything felt perfect. The kind of perfect that makes you forget about the world outside the forest, about deadlines and bills, and all the little stresses that pile up over time. But as the sun sank behind the trees and the shadows grew longer, something shifted. It started with the laughter. At first, it was faint, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. A soft, high-pitched giggle that seemed to drift across the water from the far side of the lake. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, and glanced at Clay. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" he said, looking up from his plate. I thought I heard laughing. Clay frowned, tilting his head and listening. "Probably just a loon," he said after a moment. "They make some weird noises." I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. I'd heard loons before, and this didn't sound like one. It sounded human. We finished dinner and sat by the fire, sipping beers and talking about nothing in particular. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects earlier, was now eerily silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. And then the laughter came again. This time it was louder, clearer. A child's laughter, high and light, echoing across the water. It sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to Clay, and from the look on his face, I could tell he'd heard it too. "That's not a loon," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Clay didn't respond. He was staring across the lake, his eyes narrowed. "Maybe it's another camper," he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "There's no one else out here," I said. "We would have seen them." The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by a faint rustling in the trees on the far side of the lake. My heart was pounding now, a cold knot of fear tightening in my chest. Clay stood, his eyes scanning the shoreline. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'm gonna take a look." "Are you crazy?" I hissed. "What if it's, I don't know, some kind of animal?" Clay gave me a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's probably just some kids messing around. I'll be right back." I watched as he walked down to the water's edge, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He stood there for a moment, shining the light across the lake, before turning and walking along the shoreline. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in around me like a physical weight. I strained my ears, hoping to hear Clay's footsteps or the rustle of leaves, but there was nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the wind in the trees. "Clay!" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I grabbed my own flashlight and stood, the beam shaking as I swept it across the campsite. "Clay, this isn't funny. Come back." Still nothing. I took a hesitant step toward the water, every instinct screaming at me to stay by the fire. The flashlight beam caught on something, a shape moving in the trees on the far side of the lake. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a light, a soft, flickering glow, like a lantern swaying gently in the breeze. And then another appeared, and another. Soon, there were dozens of them, moving through the trees in a slow, deliberate dance. They seemed to pulse, their light growing brighter and dimmer in a steady rhythm. And then the laughter started again. This time, it came from all around me, echoing through the forest like a chorus of children's voices. It was light and airy, but there was something wrong about it, something cold and hollow, like it wasn't coming from real throats. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "Clay!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Where are you?" The lanterns on the far side of the lake began moving closer, their glow reflecting on the water. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, filling the air like a swarm of insects. I turned and ran, the flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. I don't remember much of the next few minutes. Just the trees rushing past me, the sound of my own ragged breathing, and the laughter following me, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my head. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was gasping for air, my legs burning. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. Clay never came back. The authorities searched the area, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, but I know better. Something took him that night. Something that still laughs in the shadows of that nameless lake. I haven't been back since.